I'm Jack Blumenau. I'm an associate professor in political science and quantitative methods here in the department. And today's event, which is sort of on the theme of data, evidence and public policy, very pleased to welcome our speakers. I'll say a few words just to sort of kick us off, and then we'll move into the panel discussion. So one key lesson, I think, in recent political history is that the collection and, sorry, I was meant to turn that off. Is that the collection and analysis of quantitative data is often central to successful government policy. During the long months of COVID, we all became very accustomed to seeing how policies sort of that were designed to mitigate the impacts of the virus were really dependent on being responsive to detailed information about transmission rates and infection rates and vaccine efficacy and so on. But I think sort of what COVID did in some sense was to reveal the tip of a very large iceberg of quantitative evidence in government to the general public. And there's an enormous amount of time and effort and energy and expense being committed to developing new ways of using data and evidence to inform sort of different policy options. And I think that kind of makes sense because many of the features of the explosion of big data in recent years really do seem very relevant to generating insight into public policy. It's not just that we have more data now, but it's data that's very granular. It gives us an ability to sort of think about features of the social world at a really high level of resolution that hasn't been possible before. Similarly, sort of in many domains, we can now generate data in real time, which is sort of very useful for developing public policy that is both flexible and responsive, and again, something that wouldn't have been possible in the past. And then, sort of to go with the explosion of data, there's also been a proliferation of new tools, sort of from machine learning to natural language processing and so on, which sort of increase the ability of policymakers to extract meaningful signals from very noisy data. And so, in many ways, it's this kind of golden era of data-informed public policy. That's the good side. The bad side, of course, is that, with these opportunities come a whole set of challenges. The first of which I was sort of trying to think about sort of different challenges that the sort of data-driven policy faces at the moment. One of them is that even though the availability of data has increased, that of course doesn't necessarily help us to answer the kind of what works questions that really lie at the heart of policy evaluation. Having data that describes in granular real-time detail the outcomes of a given policy, even if you've got a lot of that data, isn't necessarily informative about the types of outcomes, sort of what outcomes would have looked like under a different policy, right? And those kind of counterfactuals, that kind of counterfactual thinking is really at the heart of a lot of sort of understanding of policy effectiveness. The second thing is that this kind of growth in quantitative information also sort of raises a number of ethical questions about how that data sort of should be best used, whether it fairly represents different populations of people, and how governments should best communicate the use of such data to citizens. And then the third key challenge that I thought about was that, the use of data and evidence in informing public policy is, of course, sometimes that politics gets in the way, right? So you can imagine that if evidence contradicts party lines or runs against the grain of public opinion, then maybe sort of appeals made on the basis of that evidence are going to sort of fall on deaf ears in some way. And so, these are kind of a set of questions that I hope that we'll engage with this evening, and it's a particularly good time for us to be talking about these issues here at UCL. There are a number of new initiatives at the university at the moment devoted to sort of improving our understanding of quantitative evidence and data and public policy. And most relevant to this, I'm looking out and I see people here from our new MSc program in data science and public policy, which launched this year. I'm saying this mostly as a sales pitch to other people who are not on this program. So we have this new program, the aim of which is to sort of try and train a new generation of policymakers who can sort of use these new tools to really sort of grasp the evolving opportunities that I just described and to tackle the challenges that go with them. The program is in its first year of instruction. I can see a bunch of our first cohort here, so welcome to you. If you're not one of those students but would like to be, or know someone who would like to be, then do get in touch with me or to look us up online. That's probably enough from me. I'm delighted to discuss our topic this evening. We have these three distinguished experts. Mallory Durran, who's the head of evidence and evaluation at the number 10 delivery unit and number 10 data science. We have Michal Nachmany, who is the founder and CEO of the not-for-profit Climate Policy Radar. And we have Emily Power, who is a senior evaluation advisor at the Evaluation Task Force at the Cabinet Office in the UK. So the way that the event is going to run is that each of our speakers will speak for 5 minutes to offer some opening remarks, giving their perspective on these issues. And then we'll have a panel discussion for around 20 minutes before opening up to a Q&A for half an hour or so. I was told to say that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded by a camera up at the back. It will be posted online on the department's website and to our YouTube channel and will be available as a podcast. This is to say that if you speak, you will be heard. If you don't want to be heard, don't speak. I think that's basically the point of me saying that. We'll also let you know when the recording is available so that you can share it with other people. So that's all from me. I'll turn it over to our speakers, maybe Mallory, go first.
This is my right.
That's your spot.
Lens angle. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me here. Really thrilled to be here speaking to you today and getting some input, hearing the questions that you have, because that always helps us to shape kind of where we go next and what our opportunities are. As introduced, I work in 10 Downing Street in the Prime Minister's office, both in the delivery unit that focuses on how we get to the things that government has prioritized as the most important to deliver for citizens, and in the data science team, where we try to bring data, evidence, evaluation, and sort of cutting-edge data science techniques to that. The number 10 data science team was actually formed as part of the data COVID effort. So in the dark days of early February 2020, I descended into a bunker never to be seen again because the country was facing a challenge and an opportunity different than what our typical crisis response looked like. Suddenly, we needed to be able to take in real-time data to be able to respond to a crisis that wasn't 24 or 48 hours long, but was going to require a prolonged response and many iterations of policy decisions. We stood up a data science team to respond to that so that we could harness the benefits of automation, of data engineering, and sort of mining big data and bringing minds together from across the country, across the government, and across the globe to help us answer those questions as quickly and robustly as we possibly could, noting that we didn't always have the answers or the evidence or the data that we required in order to do it. When we got sort of to a more peaceful phase of the pandemic, the then Prime Minister turned around and said, actually, we should have this kind of response for all kinds of domestic policy, and that's how the data science team was born, and we have sort of found a natural home working with the delivery unit, especially where we can create a feedback loop between sort of delivery and the evidence generated and the policy cycle. And I think one of our great takeaways is that as users of evidence at a policymaking level, one of our deepest responsibilities isn't actually in generating evidence or even in how good our analysis is, but how well it feeds back into the feedback loop of policy and delivery. One of the things that we've spent the most of our sort of data science skill on is actually visualizing evidence in a way that's engaging and accessible to a wide range of policymakers. Our core customer is the Prime Minister, who, as you can imagine, thinks about the Ukraine in the morning, climate change at midday, and crime and justice in the afternoon, to be able to grasp and process new evidence evaluation data about each of those topics throughout the course of the day requires some skill and thinking in how it's presented, how it's synthesized, and how that's able to be used in decision making. Very different than sitting in a room with your academic colleagues that know the absolute depth and detail of every topic within their realm. Really, you can't have that incredible depth of knowledge jumping from topic to topic. So our job is to think about how do we best use data science and technology to bring evidence together as quickly as possible and present it back in a way that's accessible but also useful. Some of the tools that we've come up with to do that are related to dashboarding or interactive data models, kind of moving us away from the generation of slide packs. I think COVID helped us to realize that you can't have a single version of the truth if there are 30 versions of the slide pack. So bringing some of these things online, using technology, using digital infrastructure and architecture to create real-time data pipelines, but also visualize data in a way that was interactive so that people could ask questions and see a drilled down version of the answer in real time while trying to understand, was the efficacy of mask wearing on public transport the same everywhere, or were there demographic differences? If you try to answer that via a sort of static product, you don't have the ability to be flexible as the policy conversation moves and changes, especially when dealing with something that rapidly evolves in front of you. Interactivity has also been really helpful for us in harnessing excellent evidence generation, especially where it relates to modeling and forecasting. So one of the things we spend a ton of time doing is not actually building new models, but instead visualizing models or forecasts that already exist and giving policymakers the ability to see, interact with, and understand the sensitivities that exist within a particular model. So policy decisions being made, we all know that there are lots of people waiting for elective treatment. But if you don't have the ability to interact with the variables that influence that, it's hard to know whether throwing more GPs at the problem will fix it, or whether actually what we need is an increased volume of diagnostic machines. If we can, in real time, show the difference in sensitivity and changes in outputs and outcomes to policymakers and decision makers, it's much easier for them to be engaged with the evidence, to trust the evidence, and to understand it for themselves, even if they're not the person who's worked through the detailed outputs and components of the model themselves. I think there's still a huge amount to do, but in my time in government, we've certainly come a long way as far as the baseline expectation of decision makers in what evidence will be available to them in making kind of any decision. Obviously, there's a huge amount to do to draw in more sources. Often when you're given 24, 48, 36 hours to provide evidence on something, harnessing the best knowledge available everywhere in the world, or even everywhere in the country, or even everywhere in government can be a real challenge. And we are now working toward building the right systems and processes, harnessing open principles and open data to do a better job of being able to pull those things, those experts and that analysis in more quickly, and really sort of working toward spreading those tools across government is kind of a next goal for our team. I think I was meant to answer how this perspective impacts the use of policy and sort of evidence use in policy.
I describe it as a vague guideline.
Oh, a vague guideline. My favorite kind.
That's fine.
I would say that we've had the distinct pleasure to test and retest our model of bringing evidence to 3 different customers over a very short period of time, which has taught me 2 things. The veracity for better and more data and evidence is ubiquitous. Doesn't matter who it is, they all want it. But the approaches that we take to engage people in that information and present it back to them is ever changing. So there isn't ever going to be a perfect guidebook to how to present your evidence in a way that best engages and has the greatest chance of influencing policy. We all need to be incredibly flexible and creative and ever moving and changing in the way that we do that. And I think working in open ways that allow us to tap into brilliant, deep knowledge in academia, in the private sector, across government, and use the expertise we have about our customer and their needs to work together to generate the best possible products and outputs for those decision makers is part of how we use sort of open processes, data, and evidence in the future. That's my starting point. All right, over to you.
Michal?
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. I spent 10 years down the road at LSE, where for a very long time, we tried to figure out how do we teach legislators to make better climate policy. And we did that because they asked us to. Sometime in 2009, a bunch of legislators got together on the sidelines of the Copenhagen COP and said, we really want to make better laws, hold our governments to account, pass budgets, and we have no ideas what laws the other person or the other country has on their books, and we really want to learn from each other how to do better. So they commissioned the LSE to start collecting all of the climate change laws in the world so they can get together and exchange some knowledge and learn from each other and potentially say, how did you guys do that? And how did you guys do that? And how did you fight this lobby? And how did you get that steel association to come to terms with the fact that we need a transition to greener steel? And that project grew and grew and grew and grew. And it became a library of all the climate laws and policies in the world. Great. So we have a library. And every time we ask ourselves a question, we need to decide, okay, what are the PDFs that I'm going to open now? And I'm going to open the PDF, and I'm going to press Control Find and write green steel. You're all doing that. You all did that in your undergrads. You will all do that in your master's degrees. That doesn't make any sense. So I got a bit impatient. Impatience and climate change work go hand in hand, as you can imagine. And I founded Climate Policy Radar, which is a not-for-profit tech startup that harnesses data science and artificial intelligence in order to put on speed those processes, to help us very, very quickly identify all of the global interventions against climate change or for climate change, that try to stop climate change, and that can be used in order to, first of all, generate a menu of options. When you are a parliamentarian, or someone working at the number 10 delivery unit, and you're asking yourself, what are the policy options that I have? Starting from scratch is often not an option. First of all, because of the time that it takes. Secondly, because you're reinventing the wheel. And thirdly, because most governments in the world don't have the resources, the time, the money, and the expertise that some other governments do. And the UK has been a leader on policy development in a bunch of areas, maybe a laggard on some others. And no disrespect to Mallory, of course, but some of her customers have made very poor decisions, especially in the realm of climate change recently. The recent mining decision from yesterday is a stark example of not using evidence in order to advance good policy. But when we try to think about how our decisions made, starting from who's doing what already is usually the starting point for most policymakers. And for anyone trying to hold policymakers to account, which is kind of the coupled version of this. So in order to do that, mapping all of the interventions is a first step in order to start identifying what works. It's a first step because then we can say, how do we take those interventions and map them against real-world results? Now, those real-world results will vary. Will emissions drop? Will GDP grow? Will GDP fall? Will inequality rise? Will inequality fall? Will more girls go to school? Will more people or less people drown in the next flood? Will more cows die when the hurricane comes and sweeps your farm away? These are the real-world results that have an implication on those interventions and that we need to map. Now, good data doesn't necessarily lead to good decisions, but the absence or the bad data definitely leads to bad decisions. So with all of those challenges that we're facing, and they're great, and Jack started naming them, we really need to remember that we are almost at medieval times in our way that we relate to data. Even the most advanced governments, even the most advanced institutions, even the most advanced institutional investors, the largest pension funds in the world, the largest BlackRocks in the world, are still not taking policy evidence into account in a systematic way. Asking whether a country has a climate change act or not is often as good as it gets in terms of injecting it into big models of thinking of what sort of interventions work. So we're trying to fix that by bringing in together all of the laws, the policies, the strategies, the action plans, the submissions to the UNFCCC, bringing all of those documents together, subjecting them to, first of all, the ability to search all of them together. So we're not subjecting ourselves to silos. You're not only looking at the 3 countries that you're used to looking at. Automatic translation helps us break down language barriers. We can now very quickly translate from any language to any language, so we can read all the documents in Mongolian or in Russian or in French. And there's an Anglophone, Francophone divide in the world, and many African-speaking, French-speaking countries do not have access because of capacity to reading a lot of evidence that they can learn from. for climate, of course, that is a cross-border issue. We also have the issue of global tracking and progress. When we think about policy making or policy accountability, we often think about local context and about the ability to track something within your own constituency and then to change it so it would impact your citizens. However, with climate change, paying attention to broader pictures and seeing how policy in one country has effect in other countries is critical to this. And the ability to track progress so we can divert resources into other realms is also part of this story. Now, the bodies that do this global tracking and progress are often research institutions, underfunded, often UN bodies, underfunded. We like to think of the UN as a very big and rich body. These are usually small teams that have to, with a yellow highlighter, go over submissions and try to make sense of that so they can decide who's getting the big climate funding, that 100 billion that we're talking about. This is how these processes are made. The need to shift that is huge. We're starting with baby steps now in order to start breaking some of those silos and hope to make great progress. And we're collaborating with some fantastic partners on this. And anyone who's been not absent from the internet in the last week or so has seen the developments in GPT chat, which is this huge advancement in AI-generated text. And there's quite a lot to say about that, and we'll probably touch upon it in the panel later. And with GPT chat, it's been clear that there's a genie that's been released out of the bottle. Something has happened that won't be put back. We are now able to write essay answers to the questions that Jack's going to ask you in your next term exam, and you'll be able to generate that text. It still has a lot of limitations. It still has a lot of biases. It still has a lot of problems, but this is the direction where we're heading. And understanding that and harnessing that in a way that identifies the problems, the challenges, the biases that it will create, and avoiding the dystopian nature in which it can go, and harnessing it back in order to use it for good are some of the big challenges that we will have. Let's talk about it a little more. Thanks.
Thank you. Of course, the flip side of students writing essays using these tools is that faculty can also write feedback using these tools. Emily, thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming along. I'm Emily Power. I'm a Senior Evaluation Advisor in the Evaluation Task Force, which is a Cabinet Office and Treasury team recently set up last April 2021. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about my perspective from that team inside government on the role of evidence in public policy. So I want to cover three things. So what is the current situation in government in terms of evaluation at the moment? How is the government doing on evaluating its government programmes and policies? Secondly, what are the key challenges and barriers being faced inside government to do robust evaluation? And thirdly, what's being done about it from our perspective? So I can tell you a bit about what the Evaluation Task Force is trying to do. So firstly, just to say it's not easy. Evaluating government programmes often means evaluating some of the most significant, large-scale, complex, high-spend, continually evolving programmes and projects. Often changing at the whim of new administrations, continually evolving with new sort of requirements, and obviously at the whim of sort of the political cycle. So always with a huge amount of pressure to report results right now, tomorrow, today, by midday if you can, please. So just setting that context that this is not always an easy task. But there's a lot of scope for improvement because at the moment we're not doing enough good quality, robust evaluation in government. So this fact has, I think, been referred to as the dirty little secret of government. So you heard it here first. But actually, that it is that among the billions and trillion pounds of money being spent on public policy each year by government, we actually know very little about what those policies and programmes are actually achieving. So which of them do nothing or very little, which of them might even be doing some harm, and of course which of them are actually doing what they intend to achieve, whether they're achieving the objectives they set out to. So, for example, the Prime Minister's Implementation Unit, which I spent a little bit of time working in with Mallory a few years ago, set about reviewing the evaluation going on for government's most significant projects. And this was back in 2019. So government's major projects, these are the highest spend, biggest scale, most complex projects being funded in government. So this is things like high-speed 2, it's sort of road programmes, new hospital programmes, asylum transformation programmes, really big complex projects with high spend. And they set about trying to understand, so what evaluation have we got in place for these massive programmes that we're running in government? And what do you think they found? So what proportion of major projects being run in 2019 do you think had robust evaluation plans in place? Would anybody like to hazard a guess? What proportion? I've set it up a little bit for you. So there's a clue. 2%.
That's very pessimistic.
Any others? 30. A little bit more of an optimistic guess.
10%.
10. Good. Very close. Okay, the answer was 8. 8%. 8% of major projects being run in 2019 were being robustly evaluated, meaning that we had good plans in place to understand whether they were achieving what they set out to. So this equated to around 35 billion of the entire 400 or so billions of pounds being spent across the whole portfolio of major projects. So there's a problem. We know that. And so to my second point, why is this? Why is there such a huge problem with evaluation in government? What are the main challenges being faced? So we've done a bit of work in the Evaluation Task Force, was our old name, to understand what these barriers are, and I'll just highlight a few for you now. So there's insufficient demand for good evaluation from ministers, from senior civil servants. There's a lack of awareness among seniors as well, a lack of understanding of what evaluation actually is, and what value it can provide. There is a distinction, a sort of somewhat gulf between the analysts working in departments and the policymakers in departments, which means that analysts are not always and not often enough involved in the policy-making process. And this leads to a whole host of problems that are really difficult to fix, to do with how policies are designed in the first place. So, for example, a lot of the time policies are designed so that they're rolled out on a national scale, all at once, to everybody. Everybody who needs it should get it right now. We can't hold this back from anybody. This means you don't have a decent counterfactual setup. Often programmes are also delivered with multiple interventions or things that they want to test at the same time. So I always use the phrase that they're throwing the kitchen sink at problems to try and make some progress. But this makes it really tricky to understand, well, what is it that's having an impact here? If we wanted to go and replicate this further down the line, how do we do that? How do we understand what bits of this programme are working and which of those need to be improved or stopped? And as I've alluded to earlier, lots of the time, programmes are trying to achieve really long-term outcomes. So how do you realise, or how do you see the impact of these within this political, short political cycle that we're in, with the pressure to report results very, very quickly? There's also other barriers to do with evaluation resources, so we don't always have the right budgets for evaluation. We don't always have the number of expertise or experts in departments to do the evaluation. And even when you do, there's often a lack of capability there. So we don't have a huge number. We have lots of analysts. We don't have a huge number of evaluation experts in government to do the work that we need to get done to evaluate our programmes robustly. So there are some of the challenges and the barriers that we're facing inside government. So on a more positive note to end, what is being done about this? What is the evaluation task force doing about it? So we're quite a new team. As I said, we were set up last April 2021, which is a good sign in itself. And we are trying to make sure that not only is evaluation done, but that it's put at the heart of decision-making in government. And to do this, we are trying to embed evaluation into decision-making processes. We are trying to support the delivery of priority evaluations. And we're trying to promote the importance and the value of evaluation across government. So just to unpack each of those a little bit for you and give you an example of what we mean by those things. So in terms of embedding evaluation in decision-making, we're working very closely with the Treasury, where we report to Treasury directors. And we've worked with them very closely during the last spending review cycle. So when departments get all their new money for the next 2 or 3 years, we worked with the Treasury to say, well, how about we advise or we make a condition of those settlements, of that money you're giving them, that departments have to develop and publish an evaluation strategy. So they have to commit to evaluating their programmes of work. They have to set standards for that, and they have to publicly commit to that. So that's something that we did in the last spending review, and we're pleased to say we've got 9 out of the 18 departments now published evaluation strategies, which hold them accountable to those standards in the longer term. So that's an example of how we might embed and how we are embedding evaluation into decision-making processes. But there's a whole host of opportunities there in terms of business case development and approval processes, for example. How are we supporting evaluations in priority areas? So we are evaluation experts in the team, so we are supporting departments in the design of their evaluations of their most important programmes. So this is in areas like energy, net zero, health, and we actually have some funding available to do that as well. So we're supporting high priority evaluations to the tune of around £15 million with an evaluation accelerator fund. This is funding a whole range of projects like police drug diversion, evaluation of the pupil premium programme, which you'd have thought would be evaluated already, but is not, and tackling drug misuse in prisons, for example. So we're supporting the design of robust evaluation. And then lastly, how do we promote evaluation and try and get people to understand the value of evaluation? So this is about working with ministers. It's about providing training. We're just about to develop an evaluation academy, supporting analysts across departments to understand and use evaluation skills. We're taking every opportunity we can to deliver training and teach-ins and build that awareness and buy-in from across departments, from the bottom up, from working level analysts and evaluators, and also from the top down, so with ministers and directors and senior civil servants. So they're just some of the things that we're doing to try and change the situation and to try and really improve the scale and quality of evaluation going on in government and make sure that we've got evaluation to really inform the decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
thank you all for some really interesting opening remarks. So I have a follow-up question, which I think is jointly to Emily and Mallory, which it seemed like there was some tension between the demands that you both see, in that Mallory described this sort of unlimited demand for information of some form, whereas Emily described a limited demand for evaluation specifically. And so I guess I'm curious about it. You know, what are the forms of information that are in high demand, and what stops evaluation from being amongst them? Is it the speed at which it comes, or is it is it more predictive information that people are looking for? So maybe you could both sort of speak a little bit to that.
Good question. So I think speed is probably one of the biggest issues going on here, and something that I was reflecting on the way. So I do think that there is a huge pressure in government to have data now, and the data that is produced in evaluations is often takes a little bit of time to produce. In order to do a really robust evaluation, you have to have a good counterfactual, and I think that is a barrier. So not having the time to properly develop a robust evaluation plan, see that through, and wait for the data to come through, I think is definitely one of the biggest barriers. What would you say?
Yeah, I think that we're really good at using data for problem solving, and less good at thinking about what we need to do now to have the data we'll need for problem solving tomorrow. So everyone will ask, what do we know about, and how does that inform the decision that we should make? Once you get to here are the proposed list of things, and you've got a sort of spending package, and maybe that's less than you thought because you weren't expecting to have a global pandemic, then breaking that down and saying, okay, we need to partial off a good chunk of this to really evaluate the program well, or maybe it's that, public outcry for interventions, or the government to announce what they're doing is such that you get the policy over the line faster than the evaluation was developed. So I think that we've come a long way in wanting to have that information, and that there's a huge amount of work still to be done to ensure that evaluation and generation of new data and information is embedded throughout the policy generation, delivery, evidence collection, feedback loop. I think that if we, successfully had evaluations against every pound spent, that the information it generated would be used incredibly well. It's the motivation and the drive and the push and the demand to have the right things in place so that we are consistently generating that information over time that sort of falls to the bottom of the to-do list on the sort of policy agenda. So I think it's not that evaluation isn't wanted. It's not that every minister in the room won't say, of course we should evaluate this robustly, we need to do that. But when it comes to not approving the document until it's clear that there's a gold stamp from the evaluation task force on the evaluation plan, that sometimes slips and doesn't happen, or doesn't happen in the way that we want, or happens a bit late. So I think still some challenges there, despite the fact that if you asked any minister tomorrow, is evaluation important, they would say yes.
The advantage of not being part of government is that I don't have to be politically correct about any of this, while Emily and Mallory do. So I actually think there's probably no tension between you, because there's obviously a pull for data from everyone. So they could do whatever they want with this data. Evaluations, on the other hand, are very tricky because they actually give you a nudge on what you have to do. So when you get all of the evidence and you can say, okay, I'm going to cherry pick what's comfortable for me, what works with my agenda for whatever reasons, policy, politics, and there's probably a varying trust in politics in the room. That's very different from an evaluation that tells you this is the right or the wrong thing based on the standards that we have set ourselves. And this is where I'm thinking that the real customers of evaluations are not only government, but clearly the people out of government, because policy accountability is where evaluations play the largest role. And policy accountability happens by citizens who vote for these politicians wherever democracy allows them to do so, and by the private sector that isn't so much of a democratic process, but is very much a nature force that moves politics to wherever it needs to move it, and obviously is impacted by politics. So when the private sector sees policies that are going to derail it, it reacts. And we've seen that in your, what was that, two prime ministers ago? One prime minister ago, right? We've seen that, how private sector has the ability to remove politicians very, very quickly. And that is where policy evaluation is critical, because putting that into place in a way that doesn't create chaos, but actually is embedded into the policy making and the policy evaluation cycle, this is where we can actually bring evaluation to its full fruition, I think.
I think one of the other things, I'm very conscious of the fact that there are sort of 4 people on the panel, or 3 people and me, who are all sort of very heavily invested in the idea of data and evidence and informing public policy to an audience of students who are taking courses in this kind of thing. But one thing that struck me about the point that Emily made about the percentage of projects that are currently robustly evaluated is, what should that percentage be? Because it's not actually obvious to me that it's 100% that should be evaluated. That leaves, you can sort of see that could sort of constrain the ability to sort of make normative choices between different policy options, you know, if you're thinking about it in those terms. And so, you know, I'm sort of trying to understand sort of what, you know, should we have more of this everywhere? I'm partly playing devil's advocate here, I think, but like, should we have more of this everywhere, or to what extent is there sort of can doing that leave space for important political choices to also be made? It's a question for anyone. Anyone who's interested.
Yes, first. I mean, I guess not expressing the views of number 10 or the government necessarily. I'm also a citizen. I'm not a citizen of this country, actually. A citizen of the world. Someone who cares deeply about the people of the United Kingdom. I think there's a really hard, good question here about what politics is for. And I think, obviously, we come from quantitative backgrounds. We are invested in making decisions that we fundamentally believe are going to make a difference. And you could see a world where the job of the politician is to communicate the best available evidence to the public, help them to understand, here's what we think is best and here's why, to get the sort of consensus of people on board that we're going the right direction and using evidence in that way. But politics also stands to just speak to how people feel. And I think that is a tension, but also just a reality that we live in, that sometimes, you know, people will feel like crime is bad in their neighborhood and really going up, despite the fact that we know that the trend in crime has been falling for 10 years. How we make people feel is as important in politics sometimes as the evidence. You know, a woman walking home from the tube station at night is sort of less likely to be in danger now than she was 10 years ago. But if she doesn't feel that way, we still need to make policy decisions that help her to feel better because she's an important member of our society. So part of it is about communicating the evidence, but we are never going to succeed in telling people that they don't need to worry about something. No matter how good the evidence is for that. So I think politics stands both to speak to how people feel in their hearts and minds, as well as to communicate that evidence. And I think those two things can work together. But I don't imagine that we will live in a world where the office of the Prime Minister stands only to communicate effectively the evidence to the public. It will also be to speak to how they're feeling.
In the role of the reconciler of tensions, I think there's no contradiction between what you said. I think feelings are a metric that can be taken into account in a model. And the evaluation of how the public feel and do they feel safe is one of the metrics that needs to be evaluated. And it's not only was somebody stabbed. Am I afraid to be stabbed is actually should be part of the framework. And in that, we talk about normative choices, but normative choices are things that can be translated into metrics. Now, we may translate them into different metrics. Some governments will translate them into, have I increased my GDP? Some of them will translate them into, have I reduced inequality? There's often a tension between those two. Now, it is okay for the elected government to choose whatever metrics that it was elected to act upon, because these are the normative values that are represented in its manifesto and in its policies and should reflect its normative positions. That is fine. You need still to evaluate that. And this is why I think that if we let governments go on a whim and do whatever they want without proving that what they're doing speaks and acts to their elected purpose or to their unelected purpose, whatever, what part of the world you're living in, that's a different story. I did have a really final cool point that completely escapes me right now, so I'll leave it. Yeah.
Maybe, Emily, I can just follow up with one more question, also relating to this 8% figure. I think I'd heard that figure before.
I know what my thing is.
Sure.
Sorry. Experimentation is important. And sometimes in evaluation, we're going to have a moment where we don't have the evidence because we're the first ones to ever try it. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It just means we need to take it into account as part of our framework of evaluation. And introducing uncertainty and risk is absolutely fine as long as you know you're doing that. That is my point. That's it. Yeah.
So my question was more about if you had unlimited budget, what's the percentage that you think is actually feasible to evaluate? So 8% sounds like a small figure, but evaluation is hard, and evaluation of some policies is close to impossible in the way that we typically think about sort of having some kind of treated group, some kind of control counterfactual. I don't know in the space of policies how many policies that's true for, and so I'm curious of if you won the Treasury battle, how prevalent could evaluation be?
Such a hard question. I don't know is the answer. And I agree. I don't think that we should be looking to see 100% of those major projects. I mean, how do you evaluate the impact of a new road or a new connection between two cities? It is very difficult. It should still be evaluated to some extent. You're right that we can't always use the methods that we would always like to use for things like that, but I think we still need some way of understanding whether the money that we're spending on those programs is delivering the value that it's supposed to. So I think it should be near to 100%, but we don't need to be doing all singing, all dancing evaluations for all of these things. It should be proportionate, and so we're very much aiming to achieve good and robust evaluation, but also proportionate evaluation for these kinds of projects and programs across government.
Yeah. I think there could be evaluation of 100% of things if we were really creative about how we were evaluating. There will not be an RCT on 100% of government policy ever. But our ability to harness big data and run pseudo-control trials that sort of retrospectively look at things that changed or didn't change, the more we can deploy, new thinking and different methodologies to using the data that we collect in creative ways, I think that we could probably find a way to evaluate in some capacity everything we've ever done for all of human history.
And we really like to feel special. But actually, a lot of interventions have been tried elsewhere. And we often find an excuse of why that evidence isn't going to work for us, but actually evaluations are based on past evidence with the obvious iterations that needed. But often evidence is discarded because it's not comfortable, not because it's not real. So I think moving the needle a little bit on that is probably helpful as well.
And if you'd like to learn any of the cool tools that Mallory was talking about for implementing these things, then you can take my causal inference class next year. I'm under strict instructions to give at least half an hour, and there's 24 minutes left for audience questions, so apologies, I've gone over. So if anyone has questions for our panel, please raise your hands.
Thank you so much. It's completely fascinating listening to what you're saying, so thank you so much for doing this. My question is basically, to what extent are numbers politically neutral and perceived as such? And I guess I thought about this question particularly when I was listening to Emily talking about evaluation, and you talked about it as quite a kind of technocratic move to increase the amount of evaluation, that it wouldn't be a politically controversial thing to increase the amount of evaluation. But in the public discourse that we see in recent years, we see so on the right, we see a lot of skepticism about establishment orthodoxy, bean counting. These sorts of ideas became quite prominent a few months ago, but they've been very prominent in recent years, and born of a perception that often numbers are used in the service of, establishment thinking and kind of dominant thinking about how the economy in particular works. And on the left, similarly, we see a lot of skepticism that numbers are used in a way that protects existing power structures, and concerns about patriarchy, colonialism, the ways in which numbers are used in order to protect these power structures. So, to what extent do you find that you do see skepticism about the idea that using numbers more is a good thing? And I guess also, what can you do in order to assuage those concerns and convince people that actually numbers are good? Thank you very much.
You first.
I'm happy to be brave. An ode to open data. You're absolutely right. And it speaks to my previous point about being able to take data and do whatever you want with it. Now, if we selectively make that data available, if we answer the questions that we like, if we only take one version of a word and count how many times it appears, but don't count how many times it appears in another language or in another flavor, then we're generating data to support our case rather than looking at the top and asking, what do I see? And asking, what do I see? Now, there's no neutral, there never really will be a neutrality. You're always asking, what is the evidence to support something, right? Again, based on normative questions, but are more people happy or less people happy, right? You can ask that question very simply, but you're asking a question. When you open data up, and when you open the models up, and when you show everyone exactly what are the words that you looked, you're allowing people to say, oh, you missed that. Oh, your model takes into account more of this and less of that. Can you please correct that? And even better, lets them correct it themselves and present a counterfactual. So that's my ode to open data and open source in a way that allows us to expose and correct bias as quickly as possible and to spur innovation on top of that. And the other thing is that these things will always happen. So identifying who's telling the story and what is their incentive to tell the story is something that we as critical thinkers always need to do. And need to talk about it, and need to, when facing a human that has a different opinion to ours, ask ourselves very honestly and ask them, what are information sources, who wrote them, who provided them, who produced them, and what were their incentives to do so. And only in asking those questions, we will be able to move forward.
Totally agree with that. And I think while government can't always, in its current state, make all of its data or all of its analysis open, we are certainly moving in that direction and have brought those principles into the way that we work within government. So when I talked about, visualizing models in a way that was accessible to everyone, it really is about bringing it to the table, allowing additional challenge. And I think allowing politicians to not trust the information, challenge it, and kind of open up the back end to the extent that that's sort of within the skill set of the individual, but see where the numbers are coming from, understand how you get from spreadsheet to assumption to output. We don't live in a perfect world, and we've maybe created a bit of a utopian version of how much data is wanted. Everyone says they want data. When it comes down to it, there always will be challenge, and I think that's a good thing. As you say, in a technocratic world, it's maybe establishment to use information or data or analysis in a particular way. That should be challenged as much as kind of the incoming view that might run counter to what our analysis is saying. So I think there will be skepticism, and that is important. We should not have blind use of data without people that say, I don't believe that or I don't trust that. And that's the reason I get up in the morning. It's the reason I go to work every day. And you've mentioned decisions that maybe weren't based on evidence. Sometimes it doesn't work. And what we do day over day, week over week, is try to find new tactics, new ways of opening up the information, new ways of building and creating trust, and better customers and users of that information and data. But I've yet to meet anyone who is hard and fast against the use of evidence and data in its totality, as long as you think creatively about how to engage them in the information.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Mallory's put it very well. And I think one of the ways that we found in terms of creative ways of getting people to value data and evaluation is by really trying to enhance the value that it brings to the learning that you can gather, especially if you're sort of making use of new technology, rapid evaluation techniques, so that you're able to understand how things are working, how things can be improved, and plug that back into the program whilst it's being delivered. Another thing that has worked quite well is to really make seniors in government aware of the value that evaluation can bring to protecting their policies and programs from the next ministerial reshuffle that happens, which, has happened quite a lot over the last couple of years. So it's thinking about ways that you can get people on board like that. So, what are their incentives? What's going to matter to them? And seeing their policy or their program live through, new administrations is one of the things that we've seen work.
I'm really struck by the idea that there's generally not resistance to inconvenient data in some sense. Like that I think that's surprising to me that you generally see sort of there being a demand for this, whereas I think there's a sort of a popular conception that mostly these sort of people are trying to cherry pick the data to fit their own narratives, and that seems to be maybe not what you're saying.
Well, you'll want to know about it so you can fight it, right? So you'll want to get the data that's counterfactual so you can protect it, right? So you can hide it, like Exxon did with the whole climate change and burning oil thing. Like generating data is a real power, and everyone knows that. What do you choose to do with that, and how you choose to employ the information is a different story.
Other questions? There was a question from the gentleman there.
Yeah, point well taken about being transparent, and thank you all for your time today. I know you worked probably today as well. So if you're half asleep, I'm sorry for what I'm about to do here. I agree, data transparency is definitely the way, because public servants will make jobs for themselves no matter what, and evaluation just happens to be the flavor du jour. But my question is really about, does anyone have a good story about how you brought data to make a decision, and what was your role in it? Like, this isn't a job interview type question, I know, but I think it would be really illustrative if you could tell us how you did it and what you found, how you assessed the data quality, and how you led your team, that kind of thing. It would be a lot of help for me personally. I don't care about anyone else, but thank you.
Might need a moment to think before I divulge state secrets. We do sign an Official Secrets Act before joining government, so give me a minute to generate an example that's well kind of versed in the public domain, so that I don't lose my job and also get deported as an immigrant.
Are you under the same restrictions, Emily?
Yeah. Might need a minute.
Let me fill the silence.
Yeah.
I think it was 2014, it was 2015 probably, the LSE project, Document Laws and Policies from governments around the world, was just getting to about 160 countries. And we were still printing it as a book. We called it the phone book. It had a very colorful cover with all the flags of the countries on it, and it contained every single law and policy that every one of those each one of those governments has passed. And it's used as door stoppers at LSE now because it's so heavy. True story. However, it was used as a prop, and the prop was used by the Shadow Minister for Climate Change, Barry Gardiner, at the time, who stood on the podium in Parliament. Is there a podium in Parliament? I don't know. He was speaking. He's probably from the benches. He was speaking, trying to defend more rigorous climate action by the UK, who at the time had world-leading climate legislation, but thought that it was doing so great that it didn't have to do any more. And he waved that book and he said, how can you say that nobody else is doing anything when clearly you have whatever, I think, can't remember the number, 850 policies in this book that says that they do. And while this is a very kind of shallow use of quantitative evidence, it's a really strong evidence of the political weight that understanding what others are doing carries, and using evidence as a way to battle the political claim that was made that we're the only ones doing anything, and therefore we're the ones paying, and we're the ones paying the most expensive prices for our policies, and we're going to wait until everybody else moves. You know, what about China? What about India? Were kind of the common things that were said at the time, and they were said in a very political way, in a way to stop further climate action, but by those who didn't want further climate action. And saying, actually, you are wrong, and here's the evidence that they are doing something, made a shift in that. And I mean, the UK has continued being a leader on climate legislation with notable exceptions. But that is a really, really strong point in making also the case for international evidence as part of this story, and not just looking at your own and evaluating it internally.
Any other
I
examples?
think I've got one that can
Please
that would be
don't
fine.
threaten your immigration status.
Thank you. Yeah, I really love this country. I do.
Yeah.
I think some of the most impactful work that we do is actually the simplest. And often that is actually about taking data that's already available in the public domain and presenting it back so that it is readily available in a consistent way across sort of a set of decision makers where a decision is contingent upon more than one person. So I think the criminal justice system in the UK is a really good example of where there are multiple departments and agencies that own different parts of a system that collectively impact the experience of a citizen. So the Home Office is responsible for policy and funding around policing. The police are an operationally independent organization that have their own data, their own insights, their own policies. From there, you've got the Crown Prosecution Service, who do the sort of decision making around charging and manage the court system. But the court system is managed by the Ministry of Justice, the Courts and Tribunals Service, and then from there you've got sort of prisons and probation. So you've got a huge number of organizations that all have some stake in the way that we manage the flow of certain kinds of crimes or cases or people through that system. A challenge that we have faced over and over again, whether you're talking about modern slavery or sexual offenses or how we approach minor drug offenses, is that the police have one set of data and one set of information that they work with. The court system has their own set of data, and each of those brief their own ministers to try to come to decisions about how we manage what is a cross-system, interdependent flow. Often it is really difficult to make decisions upstream and respond to them downstream if not everybody's coming to the table with the same set of facts and understanding. A recent example of this kind of over the last couple of years has been lots of news in the paper about the decriminalization of rape. We basically stopped by half charging rape cases and moving them through the system, and everyone was pointing fingers at the other part of the system. Well, the court system isn't treating victims right, and therefore their cases are dropping out over there, or police don't have the right skills, techniques to support victims at the start of the system, or the way that we're making charging decisions too often says that it's not meeting the threshold, and everyone was blaming everybody else. The only thing we did in that system was take publicly available information and visualize it so that when ministers came to the table, everybody had the same pieces of information. We could, interactively challenge an assumption that was being made about how the court was doing on a particular metric, or challenge how many referrals the police were making to the CPS at different points in time. Have that information readily available in a way that everyone had seen beforehand and agreed, yes, we understand this version of the truth. We didn't do any fancy fancy modeling. We didn't deploy machine learning. We didn't do any sort of advanced mathematical technique. We took information that any citizen could find by doing a Google search of gov.uk data and just made it available. And I think often our team gets a tick box for being a data science team and bringing in engineers and people capable of doing the most advanced mathematics you can imagine. But actually, a lot of the time, it's just about making things that are already available more accessible and present when people are talking about it.
That's great. Emily, did you want to?
That's inspiring. I thought of something actually, which might not be exactly what you were looking for, but it's related to the review that we did of major projects. Because the review that we did and those findings, and a sort of in parallel, we also did a review of innovation funds and the evaluation arrangements in place for those. So we were looking at both the most significant and complex projects being run, the highest spend projects being run across government, and also the most innovative, where we're supposed to be trying new things, experimenting. The whole purpose of them is to try and learn and understand and test. So we were looking at the evaluation arrangements of those as well. And we packaged that all up in such a way for Boris Johnson when he came in at the end, at the end of 2019, was it? And managed to get that in his day one briefing. And that, there were other events that led up to that, and there were a number of events that happened after that. But that was a really key moment in the creation of the evaluation task force and the sort of the momentum that we're building now to try and drive improvements in evaluation across government. So that was. It's a bit of a cheeky example for you, but it is an example of where we've effectively used data and evidence to inform a really important decision in government that's gone in the right direction from our point of view. And it was very much about the timing of that and the way it was packaged and communicated, who it was communicated to. And there were obviously other things that happened before and after as well, but I think those were the key kind of enablers there.
I think we've got time for one more question. If we can squeeze one in. Someone up at the back.
Thank you very much for your talk. And you previously mentioned the ChatGPT model and by saying that they are examples of the direction where we are heading. On the other hand, I also think about their lack in explainability, because sometimes neural networks are very hard to explain and why they are getting to that result. And so do you think that is going to be a major issue in the future? And do you think that we are ever going to get to a time where the politicians can really trust the models even though they are not fully explainable? Because sometimes they just show that they have very good results, they are very capable in many tasks, even better than humans sometimes. And so sometimes we may lack actually being able to understand what they are explaining to us.
As someone who spent part of my day trying to see if I could stump ChatGPT in trying to describe code that we had written, I'd actually be interested in running ChatGPT's own code through it to see if it could just describe its own neural net. So be right back with the answer to that. It is really good if you don't want to have to write your own documentation on code that you're doing at doing that for you. Just a hot tip from my day.
But don't use it for your essays.
Don't use it for your essays. I think this is the most exciting question of our time, and I would say that I'm a data scientist. I'm sure other people think there are more exciting questions out there. But I think there's an incredible power to using neural nets, algorithms, machine learning alongside human decision making. It's one of my dreams to run a synthesized spending review alongside the process that's already happening to see where we would have made different decisions and to be able to sort of simulate that going forward. I think that we can think of some of these models as an additional input to our decision-making processes, and especially where it's more difficult as a human being to state what my own biases are. If I'm a great data scientist, I can look into, have my colleagues look at, and make transparent what we think the biases are in our models and make them as open and transparent as possible. Obviously, it's really hard to quality assure a neural net, and requires deep expertise, but it's easier to make that transparent than it is to unpick, the particular inbuilt biases of a particular individual or, government or ministry. And I think there's a huge opportunity to use it as one tool. I don't think that right now I would say it would be a great idea to just take humans out of the process altogether and, leave us to ChatGPT to, formulate our legislation going forward. But I think it's so exciting. And, people in this room who are thinking about policy and data science together, it's really for us to, form the incredible ways in which we can use this for good, while also challenging each other to stay aware of the ways in which it can lead us towards some scary dystopian future.
Yeah, I'm going to echo the utopia-dystopia divide. GPT chat and its predecessors, and no doubt its next generations that will be connected to the internet and will not be limited to the 2021 training data, and that will no doubt not avoid conflict and politics like GPT chat is currently trained to avoid. All of those will do a huge amount of saving time and resources in synthesis and curation and even generation of text, right? Like journalism is changing in front of our eyes as we see this, the same way that DALL-E is changing the need for creative agencies to employ people who will generate the right picture for them. However, the governance of this is the critical thing. And the governance of this means that when GPT chat starts spitting stuff back starts connecting to the internet, and everyone is generating text using it and uploading it to the internet. So the model is going to run and going to use its own generated text in order to train itself. All right? We're getting into a very dangerous loop. Now, I'm about to use the word blockchain in a sentence, okay? Nobody who knows me in real life believes that I'm about to do so. Unless we have a way of distinguishing between machine-generated content and human-generated content, not putting a normative statement on any of them, but just knowing what is and what isn't, so we can potentially exclude machine-generated content from training itself where we don't want it to, and use it where we do want it to, because there will be places we definitely want it to improve on itself, right? This is the definition of intelligence is learning forward, right? This is how it's going to go. The genie's out of the bottle. There's no putting it back in. It's just a question of how we govern it in order to avoid those dystopian results. I didn't use actually the word blockchain, but you all made that complete. You all completed that in your heads, right? The ability to verify a specific piece of data, blah, blah, blah. The ability to govern that, the ability to ask ourselves, what is the relevant skill set of a human now? What are the relevant skill set of an analyst now? And how do we use that in order to mainly unpack the biases, expose them, make sure that GPT chat is a closed algorithm, right? We actually don't know the weightings in it. How quickly will somebody replicate it and put an open source model out there? That's the big question for me. And how quickly can we use that in order to input that into our evaluation models? That to me is the big question. So any of you working on anywhere in the region, this is where to put your energy on open sourcing all of this stuff.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it to a halt there. It's good on two final positive comments, call it sort of calls for action. That is all that we have time for. So before we say thank you to the speakers, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. The handle is UCLSPP. That's where you can get information about all forthcoming events. But let me finish just by saying thank you all for joining us, and can you join me with thanking our speakers?